Imagine a descent into a hidden world beneath the earth. A journey into an underwater cave so vast and mysterious that for years it was believed to be bottomless. In 1973, a group of experienced divers, full of excitement and ambition, entered what would become a legendary death trap. As sunlight filtered through the entrance, they didn't realize that a sudden shift in weather would plunge them into total darkness. In a matter of moments, disorientation, panic, and a series of fateful decisions would turn their exploration into one of the deadliest cave diving disasters in history. What happened in those depths, and what drove these divers to risk everything? This is the story of the Shaft, an exploration that ended in heartbreak and forever changed the world of cave diving.
Dark greetings, love. I am your host of Gothic Sagas, where we share eerie tales of unexplained disappearances, strange occurrences, bizarre accidents, and just plain unsettling, creepy stories. If this kind of content piques your curiosity, hit the subscribe button, terrorize the like button, and ring our bell. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's venture into the depths where shadows dance and secrets lurk.
The population across South Australia is quite unusual. The state's largest city, Adelaide, has a population of just over 1 million, while the second largest city, Mount Gambier, has only about 33,000 residents.
So even though Mount Gambier holds the title of the second largest city, it is relatively small by comparison. However, despite its modest size, Mount Gambier plays a significant role as the principal community of the Limestone Coast region.
Located just north of the southern coastline and close to the border with Victoria, the city is uniquely positioned on the slopes of an actual volcano, also named Mount Gambier. The area is well known for its striking volcanic landscape, which features limestone formations, vivid blue lakes, caves, and sinkholes. Just outside the city, fields of farmland stretch out to the coastline in the south. Among these fields lies a small 5-acre plot between Mount Gambier and the ocean, owned by a dairy farming family and known locally as Thompson's Paddock. In 1938, a farmer was working in Thompson's Paddock, driving equipment pulled by his horses, when suddenly one of the horses stumbled over something hidden in the grass. Curious about what had caused the horse to trip, the farmer halted his work, dismounted, and went over to investigate. What he discovered was a hole in the ground, about 1 foot wide, that he had never noticed before. Kneeling down to examine it more closely, he saw that the hole dropped down at least 20 feet, with water visible at the bottom. This discovery was remarkable and somewhat eerie, yet it was only the beginning of what would unfold. It's unclear how long the farmer had owned this plot or why he hadn't noticed the hole before. There's no way to know if the ground had simply caved in under the horse's weight or if the hole had been there all along, overlooked. Either way, the discovery raised a troubling question. If the ground had collapsed once, could the area around the hole be unstable and at risk of further collapse? To make matters more unsettling, the farmer could see that the narrow hole expanded 2 or 3 feet down, but then seemed to widen, forming a shape like an inverted funnel. In a worst-case scenario, someone could accidentally step into the opening, falling 20 feet to the water below. Given the shape of the pit's upper section, it would be nearly impossible to climb back out. They'd be left treading water, calling for help, with no escape. Understandably, the discovery was disturbing for the farmer, who decided to try filling in the hole with rocks. Over the next few days, he hauled stones about the size of soccer balls to the hole, dropping them one by one into the water below. Each rock made a splash before disappearing into the darkness.
After a dozen or so rocks, they kept vanishing without filling the void, leaving the mystery of the pit unsolved.
They continued dropping rocks into the water, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds, but there was no sign of them below. By the time they finally stopped, likely thousands of rocks had been thrown in, yet none were visible in the water. It was as if the hole had no bottom. In the end, the farmer could only be careful around the opening and hope it wouldn't expand. Word quickly spread about the bizarre discovery, drawing people to investigate the unusual pit. Eventually, experts identified it as a limestone sinkhole, formed as water gradually dissolved the rock below, creating this hidden cavity just beneath the surface.
Over time, the narrow opening was widened to about 3 feet for easier access. In the mid-1960s,
A diver was lowered into the sinkhole for the first time. From the edge, he descended 23 feet before reaching the water's surface. What he found was that the sinkhole actually opened into a small, hidden lake. Just below the entrance, the cave was quite narrow, but at the water's surface, it opened up to a spacious 56 feet across. On sunny days, around noon, sunlight would stream through the opening, creating a striking sapphire blue beam that illuminated both the water and the chamber below. This beautiful effect earned the cave the name the Shaft, in honor of the brilliant shaft of light. From the water's surface, the diver began exploring the cave further, descending and discovering that the space continued to expand with depth. During the first exploration, he reached about 69 feet down before deciding to resurface. The most surprising discovery, however, was the sight of the hundreds of rocks that had been tossed into the cave years earlier. From his vantage point, they appeared like a small anthill at the bottom of the vast room, still around 50 feet beneath him. Later mapping of the cave revealed an enormous central chamber where the rock pile rested, along with 2 deep passages branching out in nearly opposite directions. The main chamber itself spans 460 feet in length and 260 feet in width at its widest point, with the top of the rock pile sitting 118 feet below the surface. From this central area, a tunnel extends northwest, reaching depths of 260 feet, while on the opposite side, another tunnel plunges down to an astonishing 407 feet. It's believed that these tunnels might extend all the way to the southern coast, forming part of a complex freshwater drainage system running through the local mountains. The cave's passages are dotted with cliffs, overhangs, and narrow sections, creating intriguing obstacles for divers. Combined with the crystal clear water and the cave's immense size, it's paradise for splunkers.
a detailed map of the cave wasn't produced until 1984, but even a decade earlier, by 1973, divers had already completed 8,000 dives inside the shaft. Despite all those dives, the cave's full depth remained a mystery, and no comprehensive map had been created yet.
For many, it seemed as if the cave had no bottom. The emerging sport of cave diving, along with the equipment limitations of the time, meant that explorers often reached the furthest known points and then peered into the darkness, unsure of what lay beyond. In May 1973, a team of 9 divers aimed to undertake what they hoped would be a record-breaking dive in the shaft. On May the 26th, they gathered in Mount Gambier, setting up camp near the famous Blue Crater Lake. Their mission was to descend to the perimeter, a depth of 250 feet, which marked the boundary where sunlight from the surface fades. Beyond this point, the ceiling's angle blocks the light, plunging the water into near total darkness.
This depth also corresponded with a feature known as the drop-off, a section where the cave's bottom vanishes from view when observed from the edge above. This is where the shaft gained its bottomless reputation, as standing at the edge offers no hint of an end, just the suggestion of a vast unknown extending far below. All 9 divers involved in this attempt were experienced dive instructors.
However, given the challenging nature of the dive, they planned a practice run to prepare equipment and familiarize themselves with the environment. On May the 27th, they arrived at the farmhouse at Thompson's Paddock, signed the guest book, and drove out to the field where the cave entrance is located. They parked next to the opening and assembled a tripod hoist system, used to lower divers into the water below. Despite the hole being widened, it remained too narrow for divers to descend while wearing their gear, so all equipment had to be lowered separately. For their ascent, they set up a wire ladder for climbing back out of the cave. Once in the water, they were struck by the immense size of the chamber, even at the surface. Their primary task for the day was to establish a shot line, a weighted guide rope anchored from the surface to the rock pile below. This line would streamline their descent during the actual record attempt, giving them more time to navigate to the cave's edge. During this practice dive, the team reached a depth of around 200 feet, just above the perimeter of the rock pile and still within the reach of the light from the entrance. From their position, they could make out the edge they hoped to reach, the point where the cave floor extends horizontally before vanishing into the unknown. Satisfied with their initial exploration, they returned to Mount Gambier to recharge their equipment and refill their air tanks in preparation for the main dive. On May the 28th, the team returned to the cave entrance around noon, suited up and ready to descend. One of the divers, Joan, opted not to dive that day, so the group was reduced to 8. Instead, Joan stayed above ground to assist with supplies and prepare meals for the rest of the team. The divers making the descent that day were Robert, John, Peter, Gordon, Larry, along with 3 siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christian. They descended back to the rock pile at a depth of 130 feet before heading towards the tunnel that led to the ledge they aimed to explore. Around 180 feet, Robert began experiencing the effects of nitrogen narcosis, a condition where dissolved nitrogen in the bloodstream leads to a disoriented, almost drunken sensation. This happened earlier than he expected, and the feeling was strong enough that he chose to ascend slightly to let the symptoms subside. It's important to note that during this era, diving, especially cave diving, was still relatively new, and standard protocols were not as well defined as they are today. Many divers, including those who were relatively inexperienced, were attempting challenging dives without strict oversight. Although the team members were dive instructors, their experience was primarily in clear, open water, not in the dark, confined spaces of a cave. Additionally, there was no requirement for specialized cave diving certification. Anyone could explore these dangerous environments with little regulation. Perhaps most concerning were the safety standards, which were far less stringent than today's guidelines. This group intended to dive to a depth of 250 feet using regular air, which is now considered extremely risky. Modern guidelines suggest a maximum depth of 130 feet for using standard air, as deeper dives increase the risk of nitrogen narcosis, which can impair judgment and physical coordination. Beyond 185 feet, regular air can even become toxic, potentially triggering convulsive seizures. If a seizure occurred at depth, a diver could easily lose their regulator, leading to drowning. Given the circumstances, all 8 divers were now at a depth of 180 feet, relying on regular air. Robert, feeling the effects of nitrogen narcosis, signaled his intention to return to the rock pile, and the others acknowledged, indicating they would continue their descent. Robert spent the next few minutes circling the rock pile, searching for any animal bones that might have settled on the bottom. Roughly 8 minutes later, he spotted Glenn's flashlight approaching him. By then, both men were nearly out of air, with Glenn closely monitoring his gauges. They met up and surfaced together, soon followed by Larry. About 30 seconds later, Peter emerged with his tank nearly empty, reporting that he had lost sight of the other divers. At that moment, dread set in, especially for Glenn, who realized his brother and sister were still underwater, likely with almost no air remaining.
Previously, the group that had continued past 180 feet had been swimming and taking photos until they reached 200 feet. Glenn and the others moved along the ledge, with Glenn noticing his sister Christine just a few feet away.
Everything seemed routine. The overhead light was still clear, and only about 5 minutes had elapsed since they began their dive. However, Glenn began to feel drowsy from the effects of narcosis. Checking his gauges, he saw that his air supply was running low and assumed the others were likely in a similar situation. Deciding not to push any further, he prepared to ascend, but first wanted to signal to Christine, encouraging her to turn back as well. Glenn reached out to tap Christine on the shoulder, but before he could, she suddenly kicked her fins and swam away, just out of reach. Feeling his air was running low, he decided not to linger and headed for the surface, assuming the others would follow soon after. He met Robert on his way up, and they surfaced together. It was around this time that things took a tragic turn in the cave, leading to what would become one of the deadliest incidents in cave diving history. Just before Glenn ascended, Peter was also struggling with the effects of narcosis and wanted to double-check Glenn's depth gauge. But before he could get close enough, Glenn had already started his ascent. Peter lingered for a moment, scanning the bottom's clear waters, when he saw two other divers heading towards what he thought was the exit. Checking his own air supply, Peter suddenly realized he had no more time to spare.
When he looked back, he was shocked to see that the cave had plunged into near darkness. He was disoriented. He was unsure of the exit's direction. Shortly after the group began to dive, a thick layer of clouds had moved in, blocking the sunlight that usually filtered out through the entrance.
Peter began to swim in search of the exit, but visibility had deteriorated rapidly as silt clouded the water, causing the group to become separated. Meanwhile, 3 divers, Christine, Gordon, and Larry, were together at the deepest point they had explored. Realizing they were dangerously low on air, Gordon and Larry checked their gauges and signaled it was time to ascend. Panicked, they swam nearly straight upward instead of following the cave's sloped ceiling as they should have. In limestone caves, rock fragments can sometimes break off, forming dome-like hollows in the ceiling. It's believed that the divers' expelled gases had collected in one of these pockets, creating a reflective surface that mimicked the appearance of the water's surface near the entrance. In their disoriented state, the divers' flashlights reflected off this deceptive mirror, making them believe they were headed the right way.
They swam directly upward, only to collide with the cave ceiling. In a panic, Gordon and Christine began frantically waving their flashlights, searching for the real exit. At that critical moment, Larry's flashlight failed. He drifted downwards for a few seconds, and when his flashlight flickered back on, he managed to glimpse another diver in the distance. This new perspective allowed him to spot the true entrance far ahead. He sprinted for the exit, reaching the surface just as Glenn and Robert did. Peter, who had found his way out of the murky water, surfaced right behind Larry. When they realized 4 divers were still missing, including Glenn's brother and sister, Glenn grabbed a spare air tank and dove back down to search.
Descending to the cliff edge at 225 feet, he discovered his brother's flashlight and camera laying on the cave floor. Beyond that point, the silt was so thick that visibility was non-existent. Determined to find his siblings, Glenn pushed over the ledge and into the swirling cloud of sediment. Inside the silt, he couldn't even see his own hand, and panic quickly set in. He swam back to the edge of the rock pile, hovering there staring into the darkness, hoping for any sign of life. But nothing appeared. Eventually, he was forced to return to the surface. Peter made another attempt, diving after Glenn's return, but found nothing. By then, an ambulance had arrived and the grim realization set in. There was no hope of finding anyone alive. Shortly afterward, the police came and organized a body recovery mission for the next day. The following day, police divers descended into the shaft, reaching a depth of 200 feet. However, the cave remained heavily silted, limiting visibility. Already at the edge of their capabilities, they were unable to locate any of the missing bodies during that dive, nor in a subsequent search the next day. After the second attempt, the police suspended further dives, recognizing the need for additional training for the Navy due to the unprecedented depth of the recovery operation. It would take several months for the team to acquire the necessary skills for such a challenging mission. In January of the following year, while the recovery was still pending, the landowners permitted a film crew shooting a cave diving documentary to access the shaft. The crew, who had already filmed several other local caves, aimed to include footage of the shaft as well. On January the 22nd, the team descended to about 50 feet, illuminating the cave with professional lighting that mimicked daylight. As they were setting up, a technician noticed what appeared to be a third figure behind two of his colleagues. Alarmed, they investigated and discovered a body in a wetsuit. Filming was immediately halted, and they surfaced to inform the police. The next day, the authorities retrieved the body, which had been wedged under a ledge just 50 feet below the surface. Further searches that day extended down to 180 feet, but no other bodies were found. The recovered diver was later identified as Stefan, one of the siblings. By March, the landowners grew increasingly uneasy, knowing that 3 individuals remained somewhere in the cave. They sought assistance from a more experienced diving team equipped with advanced gear. On March the 9th, 1974, the new team began their own search. At a depth of 185 feet, they found a body lying on the cave floor with another directly below. 20 feet deeper, they discovered the final missing person, John, hidden beneath a rock overhang. It wasn't until a month later, in April, that John's body was finally recovered due to the challenges posed by the depth and the way he was lodged. Nearly a year before, on that tragic day, it's believed that Christian and Gordon ran out of air while trapped in the dome-like pocket in the ceiling. Some speculate that they spent their final moments embracing each other, fully aware that they were out of air and without any hope of escape. This could explain why their bodies were found so close together. It remains uncertain who initially spotted John, but one of the survivors recalled seeing another diver swimming confidently deeper into the cave while everyone else was heading up. This diver was likely John, who was found at the greatest depth. The prevailing theory is that he was severely impacted by nitrogen narcosis, causing him to swim in the wrong direction. Stefan's last moments remained largely a mystery. Unlike the others, he was found much closer to the surface, along the ceiling instead of at the bottom. His buoyancy device was inflated, which kept him suspended near the roof of the cave. It's possible that, disoriented in the darkness or amidst the silt, he tried to navigate by floating up to the ceiling and feeling his way along it. He may have run out of air before he could escape. Since no one witnessed his final moments, his exact fate remains unknown. This tragedy is often cited as the deadliest incident in the history of cave diving. In the years leading up to this disaster, several other fatal accidents occurred in the nearby sinkholes around Mount Gambier. The catastrophe at the shaft was a turning point, leading to the creation of the Cave Divers Association of Australia to regulate the practice and enhance safety standards. Looking back, it's evident that the divers weren't prepared for such a challenging dive without proper cave diving training. Criticism has been raised about their use of standard air instead of specialized gas mixes, but at the time, alternative gas mixtures weren't readily available. Another crucial error was the decision not to use guidelines in the cave's unexplored sections. These lines would have provided a path back to safety if the cave became silted or if visibility dropped. Despite knowing the importance of guidelines, the divers chose not to use them, fearing they would become tangled due to large size of the group. Ideally, they should have limited the group size to make guideline use safer. Fortunately, the formation of the CDAA and other safety organizations has significantly decreased the number of cave diving fatalities since then.
And that will do it for today. Thank you for watching and hanging out. It really means a lot to me. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. And we look forward to seeing you next time. But until then, blessings of positive energy to you, love.